So I just want to start by exploring how we might understand globalization. And I'm a friend, colleague of Roland Robertson, who is one of the early writers in social science on globalization. He and another guy you might have come across, Anthony Giddens, who was an advisor to the Blair government for a while, have got this kind of competing approach on globalization and also claiming to be there at the start of social science debates or sociological debates on globalization. For Roland Robertson, he understands globalization defines it in a dual sense in terms of increasing understanding of the world as a single place, so that intensifies global consciousness, and also increasing global compression and connectivity. So that's kind of, if you like, the objective side of globalization, that kind of greater kind of compression of people, of ideas, of images, of interactions and so forth. It's a long-term process. It's not been around since neoliberalism. It's been around for a lot longer, since the 15th century perhaps, at least. And it's also a multi-dimensional process. It's not just about, we might think political economy. It's not purely an economic force or phenomenon. It's multi-dimensional. So, thank you. And we might interpret football as a motor and metric of globalization, a phenomenon that allows us to measure processes of globalization, and also a phenomenon that advances globalization in particular ways. If you think of plenty of obvious examples, such as obviously media coverage of World Cup finals with a global audience of billions, and that's been, perhaps an early signifier, one might say, of a kind of global village, to borrow McLuhan's phrase. So it highlights the kind of global connectivity and forms of global social and cultural convergence that's around at the kind of planetary level. And since the early 70s, the mass media have played a critical role in advancing football's rapid political, economic, transnational expansion as well, in terms of obviously for example, the financing of World Cup finals. If we move on to to consider how this might play out in terms of a world system, in terms of the political economic structure of the football system. We could look at Wallerstein's model, the Wallersteinian model of a world system, and consider whether or to what extent this plays out in the contemporary football global economy, if you like. And to put it very basically, if you like, this model is kind of famously differentiates between three broad sort of regions or types of nation or types of region. With core nations, which are kind of dominant ones, which, according to Wallerstein's model, would certainly include Western Europe, North America, Japan would be in there as well, obviously, and one might put in some other maybe emerging nations in there with very large or powerful economies, perhaps Qatar, for example. Semi-peripheral nations who are kind of in between the core and as I'll explain, the peripheral nations. Semi-peripheral nations with, kind of intermediate level, shall we say, of economic, political development, and in an intermediate position in the world economy, which might include, for example, Eastern European countries and the BRICS, certainly, say, Brazil and China, the larger Russia, the larger BRIC economies, and then you've got the peripheral nations, and the more clearly more marginalised ones, the ones who exert the smallest amount or the least amount of political, economic, and therefore socio-cultural influence within the world system. And the clearest example of these would be the low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Southeast Asia, and the smaller countries in Latin America. One might include, say Paraguay in there, for example. And so the question would be, to what extent would this sort of model, or does this to what extent does this model help us to understand? To what extent might it apply? To what extent is it a heuristic device for understanding the way in which the world football system seems to have become institutionalized or established over the last decade or two? And in terms of core nations, I think as the economics papers this morning pointed towards, would look like the big five nations seem to dominate, to be the core nations in the world football economy, and to control the second and third levels, the semi-peripheral and peripheral nations and regions. Because they're sucking in the resources, the playing resources, and also, if you like, the consumerist resources that are perhaps in these peripheral or semi-peripheral regions. And they have this sort of, the media, transnational media, perhaps might be seen as playing a critical role here. Where you've got, for example, the football that's played in these core nations pumped into the semi-peripheral and peripheral regions. So we have, I think as Vladimir was saying earlier on during the question and answer session, you kind of have already a kind of world or a European league in the case of the English Premier League. The world's kind of, shall we say, sort of inverted commas, richest league, despite the fact that so many of the clubs are, have different levels of debt, and also rely so much on foreign capital and from their owners in order to sustain themselves. Nevertheless, they have certainly that transnational influence in terms of media coverage of that league going into 200 plus nations. And one result is that some of these nations have to schedule their league matches, for example, with reference to the possible clash in time with the matches the fixtures that are played in the English Premier League. They don't want to compete with these more glamorous offerings on global media that are available. So that might be a sign of one indication, one example of how the world system is perhaps structured in this way. Although it has become perhaps more complex, or it is becoming more complex, with the emergence of, these emerging football economies. With the Chinese league, which is paying phenomenal amounts of money to recruit some of the better known players. I wouldn't say they've quite got the best players, but they've been quite prominent in bringing in these marquee players. And also maybe with other elements of the football economic system at national level, with beIN Sport, for example, the Qatar broadcaster, having quite a prominent influence in some European nations in terms of broadcasting. So, one question here is whether we have these new nations which will join the core nations, or whether they are sufficiently different or in competition with existing core nations, so that we might talk about a realignment or a restructuring of this threefold model. There might be a kind of change underway perhaps within that world system. So I'll leave that open for some consideration. Thanks. And of course, another dimension, I suppose, that sociology, liberal word, which is thrown around quite a lot in social science circles. The sort of dominant global political economic ideology over the last, I go back to Margaret Thatcher in the late 70s, sadly. So, perhaps the dominant model since at least then, possibly before. And, to put it rather bluntly, straightforwardly, in terms of its, shall we say, top 5 elements, promoting free market, which is, includes the market deregulation of all sorts of sectors, including the media sector, privatization of public services and public institutions. Most recently we've had the post office privatized in the UK, and also our railways were privatized 20 odd years ago, which explains why the timetabling and the fare system is so chaotic in the UK. We have, this ideology of consumer choice, which is promoted, this individualistic ideology, tied to a cutting in welfare services and welfare provisions, so that the old welfare or state responsibilities are devolved and pressed back onto the individual citizen, so that they are required to take responsibility increasingly for themselves. And also we've, as a side effect as well, this privatisation and liberalisation, we have the growth of transnational trade taking place as well. So with all that taking place, we have this kind of, those would be the kind of cluster of key elements of neoliberal political, economic and social policies that have been prevalent. And for the mass media, this is certainly meant, from the late 80s onwards, deregulation and the scope for an open playfield for larger transnational, as they were, or as they become, transnational corporations to develop and to build up their platforms, their kind of their footholds in different countries and their kind of presence within different consumer markets. And Sky Television, of course, is the strongest example of this. And Murdoch himself, Rupert Murdoch, the head figure with Sky, he said quite explicitly that sport was a battering ram to penetrate, to get into new markets. And that's certainly how we use sport in England and more broadly from the early 90s onwards. And also, it promotes this kind of privatised model of media consumerism, whereas some academics have pointed out, we've moved from a media or a television watcher, shall we say, a watcher of televised football, who is like a citizen, as it were, someone watching on public sector television, to a consumer, to someone who's accessing live sport purely through purchase, as opposed to maybe a sense of belonging to that sport, to the sort of major, say, national sports events. Oh, thanks. And in terms of the football context, neoliberalism perhaps associated with various traits and factors. We have what some have called the hyper-commodification of elite-level media football, which has involved a deregulation of markets, the global flows of players, of television images, news stories and so on. Transnational TV coverage of leagues. We have private transnational media corporations with vast revenues which are able to kind of, redouble their kind of influence, and Sky / Fox is perhaps the strongest example of that. Television revenues have grown exponentially, as some of the papers earlier on this morning highlighted, in terms of the TV money that's around. And we have the rise, the separation of the big five, and we might say big four European leagues perhaps. I mean, would you still put France in the big five? Well, I'll leave that open with you. Sorry, I just thought I'd throw that in for a bit of provocation. And there's also the TV market in terms of being a basis for the restructuring of European club football. So that, we have the Champions League with its inclusion of teams finishing third and fourth in in the big five leagues, which is bad news for, teams from the smaller nations, which includes my one, Scotland. The struggle to qualify to play against the elite teams becomes harder and harder. We have growing competitive inequalities. They become more institutionalized. Look at who's going to win the Champions League. Be one of the team from the big 3 or 4 nations, if not PSG. I'll be very surprised if Leicester City pull off this shock possible victory in the English Premier League. I'd love it, of course, but I'd be very surprised if it happens, because it would. It just kind of goes against the kind of logic of the system. And so in some nations, obviously, in a more extreme circumstance elsewhere, we have media corporations that kind of control the politics and if you like, the structure of the experience of football. I think of Brazil, for example, where live matches on television, the games kick off during the week at 10 o'clock in the evening. After they've had the Brazilian soap operas, the Brazilian stations want the football to be on. And then, of course, if you've watched a match in Sao Paulo or Rio, you're coming up the stadium after midnight. Try getting home if you don't have a car. So it's the experience is rather problematic, I think, sometimes with those sorts of media-driven interventions in the football experience. So some criticisms and concerns and responses that have been put forward regarding to this influence would include, Vladimir highlighted this in terms of the perhaps last 20 years or so, things have become more volatile. We've had bankruptcies at some of the leading clubs. The top left one there is Rangers Football Club, which is perhaps still the biggest Scottish club, and they went bankrupt and fell into the lowest league. We've had, this has been quite a prominent thing in English football as well, with many of the teams in the lower divisions also falling into administration in order to survive. There have been forms of activism and resistance towards these processes, for example, with fan protests. I think in Norway, for example, fans protested against the changing in the kick-off times to suit television, and I think this led to some kick-off times going back to their original time, because the fans didn't want these games kicking off at unusual times just to suit television interests. And also, concerns regarding the wider effects of commercialisation and neoliberalism, such as over kind of ticket prices. If it's left to the free market, then clubs, really could, end up trying to sell tickets at such a high cost. And so we've had Liverpool fans and Arsenal fans and others complaining about the high costs. There have been attempts to try and control this to some extent through financial fair play at UEFA, and the effects of that, we remain to be convinced by those. And of course, we have other football nations emerging to compete. Perhaps are following the same logic here, but taking on the old core nations, as I mentioned, China and perhaps India as well, with its emerging football league, and some of the Gulf states as well. So that's the kind of political economy, if you like, in terms of the neoliberalization processes and the media influence there. We could also look at media and football governance and the impact there with the media. Certainly, as going by the earlier slides, we certainly recognise that the media have played a critical role in the financial growth of league systems, and therefore also of some of the international governing bodies. Certainly, Champions League for UEFA has obviously grown, mushroomed in terms of its value, and of course FIFA as well, with its multi-billion scale through the sale of World Cup rights, and also therefore sponsorship images and rights through the televised coverage of the World Cup finals. But also the media implicated in corruption scandals, at transnational level, with ISIL, for example, and also with the rights to South American or Copa America fixtures. And also a tendency perhaps in the media at times to avoid criticising the sports governing bodies, even to exposing forms of corruption, because they don't want to threaten or undermine their access to the rights to cover these major sports events, these football tournaments, for example. So on that side, the media, quite a conservative, neoliberal force, but elements within it also there to look for progressive change and to challenge forms of corruption or excessive, shall we say, commodification. So people like Andrew Jennings, who's been a real thorn on the side of FIFA over the last decade or so, playing a key role in releasing and releasing information, which has helped with the investigations into corruption around the mismanagement of world football. And also perhaps media working with other progressive forces to press for major changes, for example, on the basis on which World Cup finals or major tournaments might be allocated to different host nations. So the media also prominent there in terms of the news stories that surround nations or regions that are hosting these major tournaments. Now, just switching across to explore or to build on that sense of media agency, switching across to look at issues regarding the social cultural aspects of global football. Well, I mean, this is, again, another area in globalization studies, and also applies quite prominently in relation to football and media, I think, here. So a social cultural focus on globalization tends to play up or highlight the creativity, of human agency. The way in which people kind of, actively engage with global processes. They're not just passive dupes. Instead, they are active agents in the shaping of, football culture, as well as other cultural practices and fields. So, I mean, the mass media play a role here, for example, in terms of affording diverse football identifications. Things are much more complex and varied than they were 2 or 3 generations ago, of course, in terms of football identifications. We have local, national, and global fan groups. Many of the world's prominent clubs have transnational fan networks and supporter groups. We also have some curious cases of where you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of Norwegian football fans who follow English clubs because they've been watching English football live on television since the 1960s. And so you have Norwegian fans of teams like, Wolverhampton Wanderers and Ipswich Town and so on, kind of smaller, less successful English clubs, but who have their little international networks of Norwegian fans. And of course, North Americans provides another example of how migration and the multiple identifications that follow from migration facilitate different types of football identification. So you'll have plenty of first, second, third generation English, Scottish, Portuguese, Dutch, German, and so on, following different teams in Europe, watching games from their base or their home in North America. So we could maybe talk about fan identifications as also being polyamorous. Instead of being monogamous and just sticking with one club and that's it, perhaps we have, so many fans identify with different clubs in different league systems. So they have their different loves in different locations. And media play a key role in all that, and they also play a key role, one might say, in enabling football to sustain itself as a mass public event. On one hand, we obviously have the major games going on and being televised live inside the stadiums, but we have also these events going on outside, the FIFA fan parks that are, require, the giant screens. Or even, so many, pubs that have live football matches on, Champions League matches that will be on for the next few weeks. And you'll have people in all different parts of Europe, together watching games and commenting and drinking. And so it's still very much a public event. And also the media helping to shape the local meanings of football as well. The way in which they interpret and frame international fixtures, events, tournaments, happenings in football, they kind of interpret and narrate these happenings according to local and national meanings and interests. So there's still that kind of active, global activity going on, and how the media help to bring identities in and help to interpret football according to those, local and national identifications. Just kind of finishing off with a couple of final sort of points here. And obviously interested in the new communication streams, or relatively new communication streams, moving beyond the mass media here, and looking at how, for example, social media might have changed relations between, audiences, football institutions, and the mass media as well. People like George Ritzer, who's quite a well-known American sociologist, have explored the idea of prosumption, to look at how producers and consumers become kind of fused and mixed. And perhaps, through social media, we can point to that in football. How, for example, Facebook, Twitter, the different sort of chat systems as well through social media. You're a consumer as well as a producer. You're producing the content as well as consuming it. And so you have that with fan groups, you have that with clubs as well, who see themselves as producers as well as consumers, or they're not just, just, they're actually their own media as well in that sense. They're kind of their own kind of outlet for media content. And governing bodies, so they're kind of producing that media content in that kind of intermediary role, which they didn't inhabit before, but they do have that media role now. And so in that sense, perhaps the mass media are squeezed in the middle. They can be bypassed by players, by clubs, to reach supporters, to reach readers, or to reach audiences. And one question here is, what will the future hold here in terms of the effects of this new technology, this new social media, but these new media platforms? Will clubs and leagues create their own TV platforms to produce for their own main content? Perhaps, a bit like American baseball, where you've got MLB.TV. You go on the sports governing body's internet platform or television platform, and you just watch the matches directly. You don't need necessarily a kind of intervening television station like Sky in order to watch these games. Perhaps football will follow that course. And then just a couple of final points in terms of maybe emerging issues around new communication streams. One is around piracy, another one's around data, perhaps, both in a sense about the control of content and what happens to that new or relatively new media content. On one hand, you've got the global digital economy, so connectivity, the global connectivity through computer systems, through the internet and so on, that perhaps enables piracy, and it's may become an increasing issue for say football league systems to try and control the extent to which people can access live images of football matches without paying the expected price to watch those matches, avoiding the paywall in order to watch those matches. On the other side is the rise of big data, and just in the last few years it seems that there's kind of more and more focus on the kind of statistical analysis or statistical interpretation of football. The data analytics that's around in football. I mean, to what extent will the mass media help to engage with that and perhaps transform or reshape how we kind of understand the game, perhaps more and more in line with these sort of, these form of infinitesimal levels of measurement of player performances. As we get, one might say, somewhat Americanized in terms of how we, in terms of the data that's around on the game, to what extent will the mass media contribute towards providing that information and facilitating public debates on football with reference to that big data. So just to conclude, sort of summarise, as I say, globalization in football, globalization about connectivities and consciousness. Football's a great kind of example of that, and also a driver for it. In terms of political economy of football, we have these perhaps new emerging powers, and there are kind of questions about the extent to which we can, or the political authorities in football are able to intervene in order to control or contain the growing inequalities within the global game. There's the issue around the media's role in terms of the politics of football, and to what extent the media in future will continue or develop its capacity to promote democracy and transparent governance within elite level football, or all football generally. You've got the social cultural aspects of football, which point towards the media's key role in helping to kind of shape complex identifications at transnational level, and social media facilitates that as well. And you've got the question about to what extent social media squeezes the mass media, perhaps, in terms of its existing its prior influence. And then finally, just a question there about maybe the way in which there is other shifts around in terms of how we're interpreting football. Might that happen for the next generation, becoming more statistical, but becoming more quantitative in terms of analysis of the game? And to what extent the media contribute towards that, shall we say, that realignment or reshaping of how we come to interpret the game in future. Okay, that's it, then. Thanks for your attention.